He advocated for equity, and it's not just based off of the color of one's skin.
I think it's so important that we continue to celebrate Dr. King and the holiday and his legacy, because even though this country has the world's largest economy, we've got some of the greatest imbalance in wealth.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
It is even more vital now because many of the people who walked with him who were children, who were 15 at the March on Washington, are now 70. And so they're facing the inevitability of life. And my fear is, in a constant commotion world, we're going to lose the truth, we'll lose the story, and ultimately we'll get a watered-down version of King, and even more dangerously, a watered-down version of his dream and what he hoped for in America.
It's beyond important to not only remember his legacy, but remember not just him, but people like him that sacrificed in order for people like me to even be sitting here.
And all of us are beneficiaries of his legacy. I know that Tony Watlington certainly is.
You've seen people burst through the ceilings. You have a black woman on the Supreme Court. You've had a black president. You have the next in line to become Speaker of the House if the Democratic Party recovers the majority. You'll have a black Speaker of the House.
This isn't just a day off. It's not a day out of school. This is a day of service. It's a day of remembrance.
So I think that's one of the great legacies of Dr. King, to say we can be better and we can do better.
This year on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, we not only celebrate him, but we also reached the tragic milestone of 55 years since he was killed and 60 years since the historic I Have a Dream speech. I'm Bill Anderson, and as we acknowledge those dates, we look back on what has changed, we rededicate ourselves to moving forward, and we hear the personal stories of people who had their own experiences with Dr. King. We start with a local pastor, continuing Dr. King's legacy as we look at the dream, then and now.
So King was fighting for African Americans to be able to own their own businesses and to shop in mainstream stores. And so 55 years later, instead of that kind of powerful social movement, you get a Martin Luther King Day sale.
Generations have passed, 60 years since the I Have a Dream speech and 55 since Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s death. And although it is an achievement that Dr. King is still so significant, there's always the risk that time fades his impact.
But the real meaning and effect of who King was will be lost if we're not good stewards of his legacy.
Every year as we celebrate the birthday of Dr. King, it becomes more challenging to find people with any personal connection to that famous dream.
Many of the people who walked with him who were children, who were 15 at the March on Washington, are now 70. And so they're facing the inevitability of life. And my fear is, in a constant commotion world, we're going to lose the truth, we'll lose the story, and ultimately we'll get a watered-down version of King.
Reverend Marshall Mitchell is one of those people who remains both connected and inspired.
Yeah, Dr. King worked as a student at my father's church, at Penn Memorial Baptist Church. He preached the early services, he preached late services, and so he learned a lot from my dad, and they remained in constant contact and communication.
It was the first-hand accounts that Reverend Mitchell heard that inspired him.
One of those, there's a picture of Dr. King when he preached at Salem Baptist Church, very famously, about a month after the March on Washington. He was making his way across the country. He came to Philadelphia that day, and ironically, he preached at my father's church, Penn Memorial, first, and then came here to Salem Baptist Church and preached. And so the church was full to the rafters, and that is a picture of Dr. King preaching from exactly the same pulpit, and there's the exact same table where I preach from every Sunday.
The shared stories have also reinforced why maintaining them is so important.
And everybody complains about my table. They said, first of all, when you stand in front of it, you got to bend over to see. But in many ways, it just reminds me of where Dr. King was and that I'm walking in the same shadows of it.
Shadows that he feels every day and that he hopes others will continue to share no matter how many generations pass.
Pastor Wyatt T. Walker, who was Martin Luther King's chief of staff, he was also another one of my dad's students and my dad's seminarians. And when I was in seminary, when I was living in New York, I worked for Dr. Walker. And Dr. Walker gave me a lot of insight into Dr. King, much of which I've shared, a lot of which I can't share about King and what made King so remarkably successful and important to these times.
Reverend Marshall Mitchell didn't personally know Dr. King, but he was personally impacted. And 55 years later, it's that impact that he hopes we as a society continue to embrace, and it's that dream that we should never forget.
And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
If you remember Dr. King's speech, he said, you'll get to the promised land. And so the promised land always seems like it's a moving target to people who are wrestling with it. But it's undebatable that we are a better moral society now with respect to equal rights and equal access.
Next, he's also a pastor with a large congregation, but Reverend Waller's Dr. King experiences left him inspired in a very different way.
I think we need to always acknowledge that we stand on his shoulders, but it is time for us to do Dr. King 2.0.
Reverend Alan Waller was just a child when he met Dr. Martin Luther King. Then he was too young to understand, but now he realizes just how important the legacy remains.
And I think for those of us who were the immediate beneficiaries of the civil rights generation, we have to remind this country what they said to us.
As the pastor of one of the largest churches in our area, Reverend Alan Waller is still actively pursuing Dr. King's dream, even if he believes the dream has changed.
I think we need to always acknowledge that we stand on his shoulders, but it is time for us to do Dr. King 2.0 or Leon Sullivan 2.0. It is time for us to recreate not those solutions, but solutions that are in the spirit of what they did.
Doing things differently is at least in part because Reverend Waller believes that 55 years after Dr. King's death and 60 years after I Have a Dream, it may have led to a false sense of security for some.
And we bumped in this last decade, bumped into all of the systemic injustice. There was anger, but also confusion on the part of young people, because I think we may have been guilty of telling them, the fight's over, we won, it's all good.
And so the struggle continues. For Reverend Waller, like others we spoke to, there is a firsthand experience with Dr. King.
That my father's relationship with Dr. King, where they were two Baptist preachers that were doing socially relevant ministry in the 60s. So my father was a part of the civil rights movement and OIC in Cleveland, Ohio. He was friends with Dr. King.
But unlike some of the others, Reverend Waller's picture and memory of Dr. King, it was deeper.
I'm very proud of the picture that I have because it reminds me of the role of the prophetic preacher at that time. You see, I sat on Martin Luther King's lap September 1967. Now, you have to appreciate that by the September of 1967, just 6-7 months before he was killed.
At the time of the picture, Reverend Waller's father was both supporting Dr. King and another friend looking to make history in elected politics and needing the votes of some who Dr. King agitated. These two stances were in direct conflict, but his father stood firm.
And it reminds me of what I'm supposed to do. I'm not supposed to be so sold into a political structure that I cannot stand up for what is prophetically right.
Now, these are the complex lessons of Dr. King's legacy, and the reason why these stories must continue above and beyond the often symbolic nature of I have a dream speeches and inspirational moments. You got to keep doing the work.
Looking to just make moments, then you're not really looking to do the work. And if you're doing the work and you're honestly trying to help people, you'll find out it was a moment, but it will be down the line.
Yes, on King Day, but more importantly, even 60 years later, every day.
That's one day. And after that, we need to ask ourselves, how are we living in that legacy the rest of the days of the year?
Now, so far, we've heard of the memories of then children inspired by Dr. King. But next, the man called Freedom Smitty shares his experiences marching with Dr. King and continuing the dream today.
We stood our ground, and I would break out with a song. We ain't gonna let nobody turn us around, Lord, turn us around.
Now, most of us can only imagine what Dr. King thought or how he was, but people like Freedom Smitty were there. He heard Dr. King's messages. He marched with him, and he knows the importance of making sure 60 years doesn't remove the significance of the phrase, I have a dream.
And we think he would say, well, the cops are coming, they got the sticks, they got the gas or whatever, the water, let's get out of here. But we stood our ground, and I would break out with a song. We ain't gonna let nobody turn us around, Lord, turn us around. And in the back, in the call and response, turn us around, you know. So I was known for that.
In the 1960s, during the civil rights struggles of Dr. King and others, the man who goes by Kenneth Salam now
That's me right there.
was a teenager, eager to help the fight for civil rights in any way he could, known as Freedom Smitty.
I was there every day, 24 hours. My mother, she said, where you been? You know, and then I quit school. So people started calling me Freedom. They called Freedom George. He was head of the group. There's another brother named Freedom Frank, and they called me Freedom Smitty. Freedom George he returned, he passed, and Freedom Frank passed on the last one.
I just want to do God's will.
As we've previously acknowledged, the people who actually knew and marched with Dr. Martin Luther King are hard to find 60 years later.
I was on voter registration in the South, and then I just started when Dr. King was, I would go. You know what I mean? He was in New York, I would go there, you know. So that's, you know, so I just started following the movement, you know.
But they're also the ones with the clearest examples of what the struggle truly meant.
The efforts of Dr. King and Cecil B. Moore and other civil rights leaders, and sometimes even the term civil rights is sort of doesn't taste well in my mouth, because we were fighting for human rights. We were fighting for the right to use a bathroom. That's a human.
And why the dream and Dr. King's memory are still so important.
But we have to talk about it so it doesn't happen again. That's my thing. And I think that if more young people, especially African Americans, understood the sacrifices that was made for them to have this, even this physical freedom to be able to go here and go there, not even mentioning the freedom to be able to have more creature comfort.
That's the actual paper?
Yes, the actual paper. I kept it in plastic.
A look around Freedom Smitty's office shows the years of struggles that he personally participated in, but also serve as a reminder to him that the dream still hasn't been reached, so we must keep going.
I think his dream is alive, but it needs resuscitation. You know, like when you can be alive in the hospital, but you need something to help you breathe. You know, people have to really examine themselves as to what kind of world they really want to live in.
Freedom Smitty, Kenneth Salam, was there 60 years ago as a teen, which is a blessing to those of us who want to hear firsthand experiences, but can also be a curse to those forced to reflect on the progress that we have or haven't made.
And a lot of people today, it seems like we've become so comfortable, you know, with our creature comforts that when it's almost disdain to start talking about something that happened 20, 30, or 40, 50 years ago, 100 years ago.
So remember and celebrate the birthday of Dr. King, but also learn from the example that his life set and the words of people who were there standing next to him.
And we're trying to give him his reward now because more people talking about Dr. King now. If more people was talking about Dr. King then, he'd probably still be with us today, and we would have a better coalition of people who want to do something right and make our world better.
Now, they're both too young to have personal Dr. King stories, but as African-American leaders, Dr. Tony Watlington and Commissioner Danielle Outlaw fully understand both the journey Dr. King was on and the relevance it still has today. For Police Commissioner Danielle Outlaw and School Superintendent Dr. Tony Watlington, in a lot of ways, their very existence is a testament to Dr. King's legacy.
It's beyond important to not only remember his legacy, but remember not just him, but people like him that sacrificed in order for people like me to even be sitting here.
I think it is very important for us to continue to remember Dr. King, and all of us are beneficiaries of his legacy. I know that Tony Watlington certainly is.
The fight for equity and equality impacts them like it impacts so many others. Personally,
my boys are 24 and almost 22 now, and I made it a point to say, look, this isn't just a day off. It's not a day out of school. This is a day of service. It's a day of remembrance.
I think that it's very important that we continue to remember Dr. King's legacy. I'm a reflection of that, as well as most of us in this room. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that he certainly was my fraternity brother, a very fine member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, and we're very proud of him in Alpha Phi.
And it impacts them professionally.
Really should be a part of every conversation that we have, whether it's, from my perspective, where they're talking about hiring or promoting or, it's equity. He advocated for equity, and it's not just based off of the color of one's skin.
So we seek to educate our children to make sure they all can read. We want all of them to graduate in 4 years and go on to a great job or college or university or community college. We have to deal with the fact that we're situated differently in terms of poverty and income.
To Commissioner Outlaw and Dr. Watlington, the celebration of Dr. King is a day to respect the past, but also remember the positions they are both in to impact the future.
Civil rights discussion and conversation has kind of turned into I don't want to say taboo, but it's now the elephant in the room again, as opposed to being up front and center in the way that it should be.
It's hard to believe sometimes that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has been dead for 55 years. It's been 60 years since the I Have a Dream speech. But have we reached his goals? I'm Bill Anderson, and we all would like to thank you for joining us in recognizing Dr. King's life. And we leave you with a poem written by a man who had the chance to share it with Dr. King directly and now shares it with all of us.
Please don't judge me by my skin, because the real me lives within. God gave me a human mind, and hey people, it's right on time. We're not black and we're not white, not in God's sight, and we better get it right. We're human beings, and that's a fact. So don't let color hold you back. Our minds are greater than our skin, but only together will we win.